Let's have a look at the trauma industrial complex and let's debunk some of the most common ideology based myths that are contributing to so much unnecessary suffering on a global scale. My name is Jürgen Rasmussen, by the way. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis channel. So many people today believe, largely due to the writings and activity of trauma activists, that trauma is our biggest challenge, that trauma is the source of most of our so-called mental disorders and psychological suffering. Some people even believe that trauma is the main factor in what we typically call physical diseases, and perhaps the biggest challenge that we face culturally. But is this really true? Because if you listen to people like Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk, you could easily be forgiven for believing that. Another typical myth is the myth that everyone is traumatized. So let's start with that one. Is it really true that everyone is traumatized? The answer is no. Everyone is not traumatized. As a matter of fact, most people are not traumatized. Even if you look at life-threatening events, whether people have experienced life-threatening events or been witness to them, only somewhere around 5 to 10% develop after the fact symptoms of what we tend to call PTSD. That means that the majority of people are in fact not traumatized even after these sorts of events. But if you again listen to people like Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk, you could easily be forgiven for thinking that the opposite is the case. The really remarkable thing, if you want to create a story about human beings in crisis, is just how anti-fragile we are and how resilient we are and our amazing capacities for recovery. The trauma activists are doing their best to persuade us that this is in fact not the case. Here's something else to consider. People talk about traumatic events, but this presupposes that events are inherently traumatic. But the truth is, they're not. Because we don't actually experience events per se, we experience our own meaning making. We experience our own thinking. We experience what we think something means to us. And yes, people can have perceptions of being trapped, perceptions of threats, perceptions of being completely overwhelmed or betrayed, during life's events. But it's not the event itself. All events are neutral. And when I say neutral, I mean simply this. No matter what event might be going on, there is no mandatory meaning making or emotional state that you have to have given that particular event. But as long as people believe that events in and of themselves are inherently traumatic, this belief has a tendency to contribute to the perceptions of being trapped and overwhelmed and victimized. On the other hand, the more people begin to realize that, hey, it's not really the events of life, but it's my interpretation of them. It's my meaning making that really creates the perceptions of being trapped and overwhelmed and stuff like that. Well, that offers more cognitive flexibility. That offers the possibility to view things in a different way, or to even realize that the very way we view things is namely that a particular vantage point. Something else too. You you know, trauma activists talk about childhood trauma, and they kind of spread this idea that we are reliving memories from the past, that we are kind of reliving our childhoods. But again, the reality is you never experience a past, and you never experience a past event. What you experience is what your mind right now thinks happened back then. You experience what you think happened. And that thinking is always subject to change. Memory is not about reliving something, it's about reconstructing something. So your current mood, your expectations, the context, your beliefs, who you're around, things you've also experienced after the fact, all of these things go into your mind creating a representation of what it thinks happened back then. But that is a brand new thought. And the very fact that you think it is evidence that you're not actually experiencing it. You see, realizing this and getting this offers so much more cognitive and emotional flexibility. On the other hand, when people believe that memories are stored and triggered and relived, well, that belief contributes to the perception of inescapability and feeling trapped and overwhelmed. But the more people begin to realize that, hey, wait a minute, I'm experiencing what my mind thinks happened back then and what my mind thinks that means. Well, I'm not actually reliving something. I'm having a brand new thought. And that insight in of itself pulls the rug from the perception of inescapability. Here's something else to realize. Trauma is a way of framing experience. I'll say it again, because events are not inherently traumatic. Trauma is it's a particular way of framing experience. And once people kind of buy into that framework, they have a tendency to experience life in accordance with their understanding of the trauma role and the identity of being a survivor. But none of this is inherent in the experience. I'll give you some examples of this. Also, trauma suffers from the concept of trauma suffers from enormous concept creep. So one example of this is about a decade ago, when my daughter went to kindergarten, there was this organization that was there to speak to us, the parents, and it was an organization committed to ending violence against children. The founder of this particular organization, called Stine Sofie Stiftelse, here in Norway, her daughter was brutally raped and murdered back in the year 2000. And this particular talk started with the presenter describing two young girls who were 8 and 10 years old being raped and killed. And of course, that's, any parent with a pulse is going to have, some engagement with that, right? It's gruesome. It's horrible. And of course, that qualifies as child abuse, right? But then the presenter started to go through all these other criteria of child abuse, and we ended up with stuff like, a forced hug, during play. And a woman raised her hand and she said, "Hey, wait a minute. This has to depend on the child and the adult and the relationship. For example, if I run after my niece and she's teasing me and saying, you try to catch me, you can't get a hug, and you're able to catch her and hug her, and you're kind of, that's not traumatic. There's a big difference between that and an adult that the child doesn't like, forcing physical contact. And the presenter just said, nope, it's here. It's part of the criteria. A forced hug is child abuse. So back in the day, we have scholars have looked at writings from ancient Greece where people write about uh, similar kind of PTSD like symptoms that soldiers have had after been to war, right? And even if you look in our own culture, if you look back at during the First World War, they talked about shell shock. You had two kind of categories that they used for trauma. One was for soldiers, the kind of sudden, shocking, life-threatening, acute event, where your fellow soldiers are being killed right in front of you, something like that. And what happened with most of the people who had such experiences was that, yes, initially they would have what many of the old hypnotists, people like Pierre Janet and Jean-Martin Charcot and folks like that, would call dissociation. They might have experiences of derealization and kind of viewing themselves from a distance and things not quite feeling real or feeling kind of numb, for a while. And then as time moves on, getting a bit hypersensitive, irritable, anxious, having some nightmares. But the majority of them, once they got taken out of that war context, recovered over time. You had this other category as well, which were people who were just kept in combat for too long. And when people are kept in a kind of dangerous situation like that for a long period of time, where they kind of live with this fight or flight activation, the system begins to break down and people would get fatigued, irritable, anxious, that sort of stuff. But for the vast majority of these folks, too, once they were taken out of the war context, yes, for a while they might have nightmares and they might be predicting and seeing dangers all over the place and be irritable and stuff like that. But over time, most of them would recover. There are so many studies. One I like to quote is, in 1988, the Alpha Piper, oil rig catastrophe, where you had a bunch of police officers from, I believe it was Aberdeen, where a medical doctor had just done extensive physical and mental tests of these 30-something police officers right before this happened. These police officers were called out to help, pick up dead bodies and sort them and stuff, like grueling, quite horrible work, right? And when they were interviewed, a year later about this, all of them found it distressful, like they certainly didn't like it. But none of them had developed what we call PTSD. One big factor here might be that the police chief did an excellent job in kind of patting them on the back and reminding them of the importance and the value of the work they had done. But after the fact, you have a good support team, you have good quality relationships, you have meaningful work. These sorts of things really make a big difference. So the concept of trauma is kind of accurate or useful perhaps in those types of events. But what's happened now is that we've had this concept creep that if you ask these traumatologists and trauma activists to define what they mean by trauma, you'll often get written pages of very vivid descriptions of suffering, but very hard to get actual definitions. And this is where you end up in that unfortunate place where everyone's traumatized and everything's a trauma. And you have big T trauma and you have small t trauma and you have trauma and dangers everywhere. Now, why is this a problem? Well, the problem is that once you do that, you're more and more likely to begin to define and use the concept of trauma to frame your particular experiences. And once you do that, you have a tendency to think, feel, and behave in accordance with the very descriptions of what it means to be a trauma victim or a survivor, according to the trauma activists. And this is not a good thing. If this is somewhat confusing to you when I say that trauma is a particular way of framing experience, so look at hypnosis, for example. Quite a few of those who listen to my videos and watch them tend to have a hypnosis background. One thing we know from hypnosis is that hypnosis is not just about discovering things, it's about constructing things. And people have a tendency to experience what you could call hypnotic phenomena in accordance with how they understand the role of being a hypnotized subject, which is why, if you look back at the days of Franz Anton Mesmer and mesmerism, the people who went through that had very different subjective experience for the most part than people who walk into a modern hypnotherapy office. Or if you look at exorcisms or other healing rituals, there are very similar, human capacities for focused attention and absorption and dissociation and cognitive flexibility involved in generating these experiences. But they are different frameworks, so people have very different experiences. I'll give you a fun example of this too. Back at the Salpêtrière School in Paris, or the Paris School of Hypnosis, Jean-Martin Charcot was a famous neurologist, but also an explorer of hypnosis. He had a bunch of people who had various neurological conditions on the ward, and he would kind of blend that word with what they at the time called hysterics. And what would happen after a while was that Jean-Martin Charcot was convinced that he had discovered a new disease because the hysterics would imitate the symptoms of the patients who had neurological disorders. And then Charcot would kind of cue that back to them. And then, new patients would come in and the same thing would happen. But this was a result of an internalized role. Once Charcot died and the guy who took over kind of suspected that might be what happened, the hysterics on the ward no longer had the symptoms of the people who had various neurological disorders, after the fact. So what else here? Yeah, this idea that your childhood is so very important. I'm not saying that your childhood doesn't matter at all or that your parents don't matter. I mean, the Roman orphanages, where people, young kids were not given touch, shows that, well, if you don't touch young kids, it hinders their brain development. So there are certainly experiences you can deprive kids of that might hinder them in terms of developing functionality later in life. But if you look at the psychological research, it points to that, yeah, childhood matters. It has some influence, but way less than most people think, and way, way, way less than the trauma activists would have you think. Here's something else I want you to consider too. Your personal childhood is way less important than our kind of collective childhood as a species. Meaning, let's talk about what's happened in the last, well, 300,000 years or so of Homo sapiens evolution. Don't you think that the existential conditions of our ancestors, how they lived, the challenges they faced, have way more to do with what emerges as thoughts and feelings for us than what happened in our particular childhood? And just the forces of evolution. This idea that you can learn so much about yourself by digging around in your childhood and ruminating and obsessing over that is largely a myth. If you want to understand yourself or human beings better, better to study evolution and history, these sorts of things. You'll learn more about the human animal. Let's take, for example, what people call low self-esteem, or self-referential thoughts about not being enough. Almost all people have these sorts of thoughts. Well, here's my hypothesis, right? It is that back in the day, 70,000 years ago or whatever, when we lived in small clans and tribes, if you were ostracized from the group, that probably meant certain death. And as a result of that, I theorize that Homo sapiens have developed software that have made us very, very concerned with status and criticism and how other people view us and are we being ostracized. And that program is kind of running. But the fact that that program is running in your mind probably has way more to do than with the existential challenges of our common history than because your father spanked you as a kid, or your mother was cold or somewhat neglectful, or whatever it might be. So that's important to look at too. Or look at jealousy. For example, evolutionary psychologists show us this, that male jealousy and female jealousy are quite different. When I speak to male clients who struggle with jealousy, what they want to know of their female partners are essentially, did you fuck him? Did you have sex with him? Was he better? You know, it's the sexual jealousy. If you speak to female clients, it's not that they don't care about sex, but the jealousy has a tendency to more revolve around, do you have feelings for her? And this makes evolutionary sense because, as they say, mama's baby, papa's maybe, meaning as a father, you can't necessarily be 100% sure if the offspring is yours. So the big fear evolutionary for a man was, am I being tricked to invest in offspring that isn't mine? But for females, you don't have that. You don't have that risk. And if the man developed feelings for someone else, maybe the protection and the resources would, disappear over there. If you look at male strengths and female strengths and the roles we've played and the kind of evolutionary challenges that we've faced over time, this probably has way more to do with how jealousy thoughts emerge in a male mind versus a female mind than anything else. So the whole trauma framework gets us to focus on our childhoods in such a myopic way and to make so much more meaning out of it than it really deserves. Something else too, what the trauma framework so easily does is it encourages rumination. It encourages overthinking. It encourages making such a big deal out of everything we feel and every emotional state that we might have. It encourages emotional logic. This notion that if you feel something, then it's true. It's factual. If you feel that you were attacked or abused, then that's automatically evidence that you were. And if anyone ever questions that, they're gaslighting you and that sort of stuff. And this ironically contributes to the perceptions of being trapped, the perceptions of inescapability, which seem to kind of be the hallmarks of what a lot of people refer to when they talk about being traumatized. Something else too, and I've made videos about this in the past, so I won't spend a lot of time about it. I invite you to check out my recent video, The Myth of Body Memories. But I'll just quickly state here, the trauma activists spread the idea that trauma is stored somatically and that the body remembers what the mind has forgotten. And this is the whole notion of repressed memories, an idea that Freud and Breuer came up with in the 1890s. Pierre Janet was kind of talking about dissociation in similar terms before that. But it's this old idea that, we can, horrible events, that we can completely push them out of our minds, but they're somehow stored in the body somatically, and that we get these visceral sensations, whether that might be rashes or headaches or visual images or pains, and that by kind of working on and processing, these visceral sensations through body work or EMDR or havening touch or hypnosis or massage or psychedelics or what have you, that we can somehow unlock the trauma and get access to the memory and to heal it. This is not true. If you go by the memory science, muscle cells and skin cells do not have the capacity to store memories. Only neurons in the brain do, clusters of neurons. So what the memory science points towards today is that memories are stored in the synapses of the brain and that you need neurons, clusters of neurons, to store memories. Also, implicit memory doesn't really store sensations. It stores movement patterns. And you can't take these visceral sensations and kind of translate them into autobiographical memory. The whole idea of repressed memory, or what's being called in the DSM, dissociative amnesia, if you look at the memory science, the memory science clearly points to memory not working that way. It has not been proven at all that we repress memories. Sure, people can forget memories. They can experience things and just not think about them for a decade. But this idea that you can, let's say, be raped or abused, and you can repress the memory to the point where you have no conscious awareness that it even happened, but it's stored either in the unconscious mind or the body, and that therapy can later kind of retrieve these memories. This is a myth. This is not accurate. And when people do this type of work, the risk for false memories is enormous. The psychologist and memory researcher Richard McNally has called this whole repressed memory epidemic the greatest scandal in mental health since lobotomy. The science writer Mark Pendergrast estimates that in the United States, in the early 90s alone, up to 1 million people a year recovered repressed memories in therapy, and these are in all likelihood false. Untold people have been charged with crimes based upon repressed memories as the only evidence, and quite a few people have been convicted to prison. Some of these cases have been overturned, but not all of them. I have videos on my channel on repressed memories and false memories. There's one titled "How Millions Remembered Sexual Abuse That Never Happened." I highly recommend you check out those. Also check out Memory Warp by Mark Pendergrast if you're curious. Uh, Another important myth: trauma does not create multiple personality disorder, or what we today call dissociative identity disorder. This is another myth. Now, I'll grant you this: there is a correlation, even though it's kind of weak, but there is a correlation between trauma and dissociation. So by dissociation, it's meant a kind of, people might have derealization where things kind of seem unreal. They might have depersonalization where it seems as if their sense of self has temporarily changed or disappeared or radically shifted. Or it might be viewing themselves from a distance, being very highly absorbed, seeming to have gaps in memory, these sorts of things, right? So there is some correlation between trauma and dissociation. But the theory of multiple personality disorder, or what we today call dissociative identity disorder, is that when the trauma is so enormous, the dissociation is so severe that the mind splits off into these separate, distinct personalities with their own memories, and that there is an amnesia condition between these various personalities. Um, this is an old myth. The psychological science does not at all support this idea. What the evidence supports is that these conditions are what's called iatrogenic, meaning created in therapy. So these are therapists who, just like with repressed memories, kind of suggest to clients that they have these parts that kind of run automatically. Do you feel as if there's as if this is just happening, or that there's a different part of you that's somehow in charge of that, and could I speak to that part? And so this is something that therapists tend to call out. And if people are in an environment where that sort of behavior gets reinforced and rewarded, and especially if they're highly hypnotizable, people can generate this. And it can even show up, on a brain scan, that the activity of the brain is quite different. But what works to help these folks is not trauma work and digging for memories and stuff like that. It's becoming removed from the context, where no one no longer treats you as a multiple, where no one no longer calls out alters. When people do that, this stuff has a tendency to disappear. If you want to read more about that, I could recommend to you Nicholas Spanos's book, Multiple Identities and False Memories. Excellent book. There's also an excellent book by Paul McHugh called Try to Remember, which also goes into this quite extensively. So the idea that trauma is the source of most of our challenges in life just isn't true. Now, if people over time kind of live in a fight or flight mode, and they feel trapped and they feel overwhelmed, might a lot of people, begin to develop, whether that's panic attacks or get very depressed and stuff like that? Sure. Yes, absolutely. And might people also develop what we call physical disorders as a result of that? Yes, they can. And one thing I've seen in the hypnosis world is that people have the capacity to embody certain ideas. I can't prove this, but personally, I'm quite convinced that strong identities of not being worthy of life, for example, can result in diseases such as cancer. But I can't prove that scientifically. There was a medical doctor, by the way, called Reich Gerd Hammer, a German medical doctor who developed testicular cancer right after his youngest son was shot and killed. And he was so convinced that there was a correlation, and he started asking his cancer patients, on the ward, if they had experienced a trauma that was acute and sudden and shocking and that felt isolating, and he found that pretty much everyone had. So he became convinced that trauma, or a particular type of trauma, was the source of cancer, and then he kind of extrapolated that onto pretty much all disease. uh, he's dead now, by the way. He used to live in a neighboring city about an hour away from my office. But is there something to it? Most likely. I'm saying this anecdotally. Most likely. Is it really true? Like, does it scientifically, can you say that it's that way? Not at all. Right? So, but we can embody symptoms. We can communicate indirectly. If you look at, for example, what's called the case of the sleeping beauties, particular types of refugees in Sweden from certain ethnic groups have developed what's called resignation syndrome. I highly recommend that you read up on it. There's a neurologist called Suzanne O'Sullivan who's written a book about it, called The Sleeping Beauties. She also writes about other interesting cases of social contagion as well, such as the Havana syndrome and the witches of Leroy in New York, these sorts of cases. But these young adults and teenagers with resignation syndrome would like gradually retreat from the world until you could no longer reach them. Like some of the reflexes even no longer worked, and they would have to be cared for 24/7, and they seemed to be, unresponsive, and they would stay that way for months or years. And Suzanne O'Sullivan, as a neurologist, came to work on these cases and do research. And she said, everyone wanted to ask the question, what's happening in their brain? But there was no proof of any pathology. But what she said, what you perhaps want to ask is what's happening in their life. This is likely a form of protest, a form of embodied communication that communicates way more loudly than words could ever do. So we humans can embody ideas, and we have enormous capacities to do that. Couple of other things too. If you talk about relationships, for example, having a so everyone's victimized in life. In like stuff happens to us that we can't really do that much about. Let's say that ran a hotel, somewhere during the COVID pandemic, and the government just shut it down. You could say that you were a victim of COVID and government policies, right? But a victim identity never really does anyone ever good. And what I see, for example, is a lot of people these days are trying to have their cake and eating it too, meaning they're trying to build their own identity as this empowered person, while at the same time doing it from this victimology base. You see this a lot with radical feminists, for example, where the message is that the woman is always morally superior to the man. She's better, essentially. She's purer, she's morally superior. And every challenge she has in life is due to her being a victim. She lives in a patriarchy and stuff like that. Try having a relationship with another person if your kind of orientation is that, A, on the one hand, you're morally superior and you're a victim. The problem with this is that people who have a victim identity, there is no reason for them to really learn anything or to really be self-reflective or to hold themselves accountable or to be decent or to have any standards upon their own behavior, right? It's all about other people and how they have to change and how they have to do things differently. So this sort of mindset has a tendency to ruin relationships or make it almost impossible to have relationships. Something else too that I think is worth mentioning. This sort of framework that when people behave badly and they're abusive, for example. So let's say you're dealing with someone who has highly psychopathic traits or highly narcissistic traits, for example. This notion that human beings are just pure at their core and if anyone behaves badly, it's due to someone having done something to them. It's all the result of childhood trauma. And if only they get therapy and hugs, they'll change, and therefore you should forgive them and give them second chances. This can be an extremely dangerous orientation, a very naive orientation, which ironically can contribute to feeling traumatized. Because if you look at a lot of the people who develop what we call PTSD, you'll often see deep betrayal. It's not the events themselves, but it's this notion that how can human beings be that way? I didn't know that level of evil or people could be that way. It's so outside of their map, right? So, but here's the thing about this. Psychopathy, for example, is not really caused by childhood trauma in all likelihood. There's a lot of evidence that people who have these kind of cluster B personality tendencies, the dark tetrad, who are Machiavellian, psychopathic, narcissistic, and sadistic to way higher degrees than the rest of us, that this has a heavy genetic load. A lot of it seems to be nature. Some of it also is nurture, but they know what they're doing, and they're doing it on purpose, many of these. And it's many of these folks are predatory and parasitic, in a sense. And this notion that, it's all due to childhood trauma just does not fit with the evidence. I'll bring up a final thing too. For meditators, for some reason, when I look at what you could call the awakening industrial complex, meditators and awakening teachers have gone gung-ho with these old psychodynamic frameworks and trauma and repression and shadow work and all that sort of stuff, right? So let's say that someone they're meditating, they're listening to an app, or they go to a retreat or something like that, and they suddenly have a seeing through the self illusion or an experience of the sense of self disappearing for a moment. This can happen in many ways: psychedelics, meditation, in flow states. And let's say that they experience some of those type of dissociative symptoms, as a result. With a trauma framework, a lot of these people now go, oh shit, this is evidence of trauma. And now they start to dig for memories, and they start to interpret everything they experience as sign of trauma, and they start to dig for memories, and they might either end up with these false memories, Or even if they never have any memories, they might end up with the belief that they were abused and with this kind of survivor identity. So, not very useful. I hope this was useful for you. If you would like to make some sort of change in your life, know that I see clients full time online from all over the planet. See if you're wondering whether you and I could be a good fit. I invite you to send me an email at provocativehypnosis.com. If you're watching this in 2025, I have a seminar coming up starting June 3rd on how to apply meditation and mindfulness practice in a change work and psychotherapy practice, and how to troubleshoot with people who have gotten stuck on the meditative path. So if this is of interest, check out the seminar page at provocativehypnosis.com. As always, thanks for listening.